And I'm wondering, what is the most memorable, single most memorable experience of seeing plants in the wild? Or what site would you revisit tomorrow if you could?
Yes, well, that's quite a difficult one because I've seen lots of really, really
I know.
interesting stuff. I guess.
Fields of Eremurus has got to be right up there, surely. Those foxtail lilies, my word.
Yeah, those Eremurus are pretty amazing. But I think the most amazing sites I've been to are the sites. It's probably not like a plant colorimeter or something like a needle. I think it's more like an emotional experience.
Yeah.
And for me, probably there's two sites I would probably pick, and they're both in China. And one is a mountain range called Mount Erliang, and it's covered by Davidia involucrata forest, the handkerchief tree.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a piece of forest which, as far as we can see, has never been felled. It's on very precipitous slopes, and it's about 2,000 meters, and it's full of cercidophyllums and magnolias and zelkovas and davidias. It's just an extraordinary place. And the other place, which is it's not too far away, is a place called the Balang Shan. And the Balang Shan is a mountain in western Sichuan at about, well, where you look at it, about 4,000 meters. So it's climatically quite similar to Scotland. And covered with the most extraordinary gentian blue corydalus, or corydalus, some people say. I say corydalus, so I don't know who's right.
I think most Aussies do too.
Just the most extraordinary place, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, with the odd yak staggering around in the mist type thing. So yeah, I mean they're two places which I think were the most core blimey moments for me.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's been many. I mean, there's been many.
Well, they're making me call blimey in my head just as I imagine that. To be under Davidia, a forest of Davidia in bloom would just be outrageous.
Yeah, just amazing. I mean, just profoundly beautiful. And of course, the curious thing is that Britain, 2.6 million years ago, many of those species were in Britain.
Wow.
So Britain, the slate is wiped clean by the ice ages, completely. But we know from the fossil record that cercidophyllums and similar related trees of East Asia today were growing in Britain.
Wow.
And so you had a hugely rich biota which was wiped away 2.6 million years ago, or started to be wiped away 2.6 million years ago. So when I see those places, it always makes you think you live here and you think it's like this. But that's one of the interesting things about traveling and seeing. When it's got like a narrative that ties it all together,
Oh, absolutely.
So anyway, that's just an aside, really.
How does seeing plants in the wild inform the way you garden at home in your own little Sheffield garden?
Yeah, well, that's quite an interesting question because I guess it does several things. I mean, it's always there as a sort of like a what if bubble floating above my head. So, I don't tend to garden very much within what you might say is the typical nursery industry plants of the UK. So I'm quite interested in using stuff that other people don't use. I'm not so much interested in that as a principle. What I'm really interested in is exploring things that other people aren't exploring. And the wild gives me that because, if you think about it, gardens, in any nation state, there's a certain number of tropes, which govern, and most stuff falls into those tropes, and that refers to plant selection and how plants are used. And I think by seeing things in the wild, you can stand outside of those tropes, and you can imagine, the diorama swaying in the wind in a grassland, as opposed to seeing it as something you have in a border type thing. So I think that's really helpful. And I think the other thing that's really helpful for me in terms of gardening, it gives me a much greater understanding, or it's given me a much greater understanding of how plants interact together. And so how far can you push the boat out and how much interaction can you have? So, I'm very into these ideas of something layering on top of something else to give very long flowering seasons. And if you've never really looked at nature where that's the predominant form of sort of organization, that's much harder to get your head around that. So, you know, I think that's what's really been useful for me. But I think you know, that idea of the what if bubble, the gas in the tank, you know, thinking beyond the trope is a really useful thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's probably the biggest question around naturalistic planting for me, and the integration of it into gardens of different sizes and different forms in different locations is recalibrating those tropes. You know,
Yeah.
that we're moving to a whole new trope, and that we've talked before about the question of, you know, for me, the most obvious trope now down the naturalistic line is entirely within the realm of herbaceous perennial planting. And as so far, there are almost no tropes. There are almost no new models or visions of how to start gardening naturalistically with woody material.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm, you know, in my dotage, you know, the thing is, when you're a researcher, you know, that's the dog carrying a bone across the floor type thing. I might have to just remove that from him. You'll get bored in a second. Yeah, I think, you know, when you're a researcher, you know, you focus very much for, say, 20 years, 30 years of your life on something. And of course, and everyone thinks that's all you're interested in, herbaceous plants. But in actual fact, of course, you know, that's never been the case. But, you know, woody plants are harder to work with because they're much longer time scales. And so I am increasingly interested. And I mean, I've just written a new chapter in the dynamic landscape book that we're rewriting, and it's all about shrubs. And we didn't have a chapter initially on shrubs. And that was partly just, you know, because we were both in our tunnels looking down. And the shrub had a bad rep in the UK because, you know, we'd used it in these massive monocultures, you know, over hectares, square kilometers, and everyone thought, oh God, I can't bear any more of it. But once you free the shrub up from being a great blob of infinite extent, and once you think of it as something which things articulate around, and you see through it, and it gives this structure and dynamic moments of change, then the shrub is an entirely different beast. So I'm really very interested in shrubs now. And, you know, and obviously having lived in Australia where the shrub is such an important life form. So I think it's just a question of use. And again, I think looking to nature and looking at what happens, say, in an Australian context after a fire, when really sometimes really scruffy vegetation then becomes really extraordinarily beautiful and dynamic and fresh. And then how that can then be used in cultivation to use things like coppicing or whatever to achieve similar effects. I think those ideas are really, really exciting. You know?
Yeah. Well, what I find really curious about that is, in one sense, that the tropes then are not necessarily about recreating a piece of bushland as we know it. It's, you know, that it is about taking those responses after fire, looking at the way plants can, under extraordinary circumstances, respond, and how do we then create some kind of visual model out of those extraordinary responses? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, my interest, I mean, I guess I'm odd in the sense as someone who's sort of like, I suppose, an ecologist is one of my hats on. And I'm an ecologist who's interested in the notion of experience when you look at these things. You know, I'm not just interested, you know, I'm interested in what it does in terms of the, you know, the dopamine or the in your brain or whatever, you know, and it's about, so, you know, I think you're right. It's about creating experience through having all these little levers and understandings. That's the really interesting bit.
I feel like that the use of trees and shrubs, the woody material thing, is not just, the lack of that is not just about longevity. It's also about the fact that we miss out on the immediacy, the kind of exquisite seasonality that that perennials have, with volume change as well as floral seasonality. Sure. You know, yeah. There's that fantastic sense of engagement with a plant that changes almost daily as you go to visit it, and then the flowering, and then the seeding, and that almost no woody plant, beyond things, you know, maybe deciduous trees, have that same sense, or that they may have the visual shift, but nothing has the kind of seasonal volume, thing that's so thrilling.
That's true, but of course the flip side of the thrilling bit is negatives too. In that things don't look so good after a 40-degree day.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the flip side. I guess from my point of view, where we're talking about, you asked me about the garden, and obviously my garden is punctuated by a series of apple trees, which give us sort of height and a scale.
Mm-hmm.
But very often, when you work on projects and people want you to make herbaceous vegetation, I'm often very conscious of that. Even with the very biggest material, it often feels a bit flat.
Yeah.
So I think for us, I'm really interested in this idea, I've christened mini wood pasture. Yeah, and right. It has a nice name. And the idea is you have large shrubs or small trees, perhaps multi-stems, which punch out at intervals. Right. Across the herbaceous sheet, and you get these different shade zones, and you get open and closed, and it's very, very good for wildlife, that mixture of open and closed. So I'm quite interested in transferring those ideas. So my next garden, there'll be a lot of wood pasture.
Yeah. So it's savanna rather than prairie.
It's savanna, really. Yeah, it's a savanna. Yeah, and and I think it's just visually, probably much more successful, and the trees the shrubs don't have to be, it doesn't have to be huge, the woody material, but it has to be quite see-through, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You have to get away from the blob.
Yes.
The blob, which creates a visual wall and allows you to visually connect other spaces. I think that's not a good thing in the main.
Which I imagine means minimal canopy densities.
Minimal kinds, and things which form big, massive domes. I don't think they work so well in that genre. I think you need to have stuff which is more like that.
Yes, yeah.
And you've got clear stems, and I think that's
yeah.
In the northern hemisphere context, things like hazels work very well,
right,
visually, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, have you spent much time in New Zealand, James?
I've spent a little bit of time there. I've only been there. Have I just been? I've been there twice, I think. And it was quite a long time ago. I think the last time was about 2005 or 2006. And that was quite an interesting experience because, in New Zealand, there was obviously a very rich sort of gardening tradition. And then there was a new gardening tradition, which was basically about sedges. And at the time, everywhere seemed to have been covered by one species of sedge. And I thought this was really interesting because everyone seemed to, some of the people seemed to think this was very exciting because it was sort of native and therefore it was going to save the world. And yet I was pretty damn sure that I was an invertebrate. I'd much rather live in the traditional gardens where there'd be a lot more opportunities for resources. And it was as if New Zealand had been taken over by jewelry designers. It was this one dimensional. Oh yeah. What's really good is sedges. And so I thought, I thought it was fascinating culturally. I thought those two conflicting worlds,
yes,
and all of the political stuff that went around that about, oh, you're not good, but I am good. Which was much of which was very badly informed ecologically, I have to say.
Yes.
So anyway, so that was the last time I was there, and New Zealand's got some great stories, hasn't it? I think this police officer chief of police in Auckland, who introduced grouse and heather to the mountains of the North Island so they could go shooting. And the grouse failed and the heathers didn't.
Yeah. And stoats and weasels.
Yeah, stoats and weasels. Yeah, no. It is wacky, but of course, Australia had its naturalisation societies too.
Oh, I know, but I'd say, nothing's done the damage to the bird life that the stoats have done there. It's just, and given the fact that they're, flightless birds is what they specialised in.
Exactly. No, yeah. Well, it is a bit of an unfortunate choice.
Combination. So. Yeah. having seen some plants in the wild, or seen some natural plant communities there in New Zealand, are there any plant communities that you feel are ripe for translation into either gardens or designed plant communities?
Well, I think one of the things, and it's not just really about New Zealand, I think it also links into South America too. Because, visually, a lot of New Zealand looks very much like South America. And clearly there are there are tectonic drift relationships between the flora. So, spending a lot of time in Argentina and Chile and this sort of stuff, you really see the connections visually between these places. So I think one of the things there is coming back to the sedge, or coming back to the tussock graminoid. If you come back to the tussock graminoid, I do think there's some really interesting stuff in the tussock graminoid, but not as these austere monocultures, really using the tussock graminoid as a structure out of which a lot of diversity pops its head out, because the sedge thing I was being so rude about a little while ago, that's just an impoverished form of the natural systems there, which, are richer than that. And in some cases, much richer. And probably when there were lots of moas hanging around, I imagine when there was a lot more herbivore pressure in New Zealand, I bet those tussock grasslands were much more open and had a lot more stuff in them. And so therefore, I think that's quite an interesting thought, that might be a vehicle. And you could imagine these things at different heights. And look, it's the same. It's not very different to what people like Cassian Schmidt do. Hermanshof. It's just with different plants.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go to South America, I came across an amazing place in the mountains, northern Argentina, on the Altiplano, where you had tussock grasslands with begonias between.
Good heavens.
And this was just an amazing, on drugs experience, and so I think there's there's a huge range of possibilities. And hey, we're back to seeing some of the possibilities which you might never imagine, because if you'd never seen stuff in the wild type thing.
Mm. Well, you think of those grasslands around central Otago, and yeah, I was really surprised to see how monocultural a whole lot of that was. And the only other thing I saw kind of en masse there was thyme, as the culinary thyme, having escaped apparently during the gold rush years. But that's really interesting to me, to think of using that as that basic matrix through which a whole lot of other things could rise and fall. It seems like a really obvious solution, but it does come back to almost that, also the same challenge of using a whole lot of Australian stuff, that until we can come up with some tropes or some aesthetic kind of models that can absorb woody plants, then there's so much of the New Zealand flora is sitting there, either locked up in its kind of forested setting, or has been absorbed to be used in a much more traditional way, but just reformatted. So I can think of this amazing garden in that area where it's basically almost of Versailles-like scale and form, really formal long avenues, all delineated by New Zealand native plants. It's extraordinary. And I can think of a Japanese garden where they've used all native plants, but to create something which is wonderfully kind of restrained and very foliage texture based, very, very much like a Japanese garden. But in that case, it's readapting this into known tropes. But it's a really big challenge, that thing of then finding, particularly when you're adapting forest plants into a garden setting. So you can't hope to achieve the same kind of feeling or dynamic, can you? It's got to be a twist from reality, a new way of using this plant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, in New Zealand, a lot of the woody material has very strong textures. Yeah. I mean, we're using at the moment, for example, I'm redesigning the Southern Hemisphere garden with Sarah Price at the Olympic Park, and there, what we're going to do is we're going to use things like we're going we're going to broaden it from mostly being South African, because that's just an artifact of the fact I was working a lot on South African stuff at the time, and I just wanted to fly a kite. But what we're going to do is we're going to use things like coppices of oh god, what do you call it? No, what's the tall thing? Pseudopanax?
Yeah, pseudopanics. Yeah.
Pseudopanax. Pseudopanax ferox.
Yeah,
That's
right. Yeah.
It's early in the day for me. So we're going to use like little, we'll probably plant sort of 6 in a meter hole.
Yeah, right.
And we're going to create these sort of structures which are going to emerge out of these tussocky grasslands with lots of stuff in them, so that's a little bit like what you're suggesting. We're just going to be working on creating extraordinary effects, and we're not really in hock to making it look like a mirror image of nature, and we're not interested in being Versailles. We're not interested in that trope. So it's something new, a reassembly.
Yes,
I think. But it's difficult, isn't it, for people, because there are all these political and philosophical ideas about, if we hold a mirror to nature, somehow it's better than if we synthesize something which doesn't exist anywhere. And of course, I think if you look at it from an animal's perspective, a user's perspective, they probably wouldn't be too bothered in the main, as long as some of the key species are there, type thing. So there's all that stuff, and that sort of holds people back, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, in Australia, we all know about how blinkered some of the debates have been there about where do you come from.
Yeah.
About plants.
But yes, but what you're expanding it to is not only is there any integrity about the provenance of that, but is there any integrity about the dynamic or the appearance of the plant community that you're choosing to create in a garden setting? Does it look like something I know in the bush? And if not, is it valid?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think we have to move away a little bit from this idea that, there are horses for courses, aren't there? I mean, there are things which are the right thing to do in a certain place where you just want to expand the size of the patch or something, to make, like if you think about nature as a series of stepping stones, and trying to make those stepping stones bigger, then that's absolutely the right sort of thing to do. But whether it's the right sort of thing to do in an Auckland garden is an entirely different matter. And, we shouldn't be trying to apply the same measures of goodness, I think, because I think that's a bit facile, actually. I mean, it's, we live in a cultural realm, we're interested in experience. We have to have a balance between supporting life and creating experience, because that's what we do, And I think that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. And what it means is when you do that, you might lose some things in terms of ecological benefits, but you might gain some other benefits. It's a 2 steps forward, 2 steps back game.
Yeah, well, it's certainly not a bad thing, but it's a mature thing, and that's the trouble. You've got to kind of mature into that place of seeing that, seeing the validity in the idea that man, as part of nature, can validly interact with it and alter it without actually undermining its integrity.
Well, exactly. And I mean, if you look at culture, landscapes which have been long managed by indigenous people, clearly what you see, what the British saw when they got off the boat in New Zealand, which they saw as this wilderness. This was simply a cultural landscape. The Maori, even over a relatively short period of time, had no doubt profoundly changed distribution patterns and what that place looked like. And when I stomp around in Africa, I'm always very conscious of the fact, that people have been grazing these landscapes for at least probably 10,000 years or something, and that human influence goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And so what are you holding a mirror to?
Yes.
By the way, one fascinating little fact for you, you might be useful when you're in New Zealand or either remotely or otherwise. There's a paper just being published looking at modelling how cities essentially move to become other cities climatically with climate change, and it's very good in terms of getting people to get their heads around what the degree of change we're talking about. And what the data is showing is that cities are moving towards the equator at 20 kilometers per year.
No. Golly. Oh, I'm going to write that down. Yeah. Wow.
So, and they're now saying London will be Barcelona in 2050.
Wow.
And so I suspect your Antipodean New Zealanders are not aware of quite that this is the scale of things. It's really interesting. It's a real fantastic way to contextualize the future.
It totally is. That isn't it amazing how all you need to do is nail a concept like that to totally shift the way people are thinking about it, to reframe the way people are thinking about it, because that is astonishing to think of it like that.
I did a gig with Colorado the other day, and I had visions what these people all sat there with Trump stickers on and like 10-gallon hats. And so I couldn't resist, of course, poking them.
Of course.
Anyway, there you go. They probably thinking we're not having him back again.
Oh, look, thank you so much again.
No problem.
Enjoy your day.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much. See you, James.
I'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. All the best.